The dismissal hit Isabella before she even set down the empty silver platter. Look at her, still trying to act professional like she's more than just a waitress with baggage. 3 socialites in designer gowns sneered from the edge of the yacht's lounge, their eyes cutting through Isabella's faded uniform. Isabella clutched her serving tray tighter against her chest, her heart pounding as their laughter mingled with the sound of the waves. Honey, no man with real status is ever going to look twice at a struggling single mom. You're just the help, know your place. Isabella's jaw tightened, but she kept her head down. She had learned long ago that reacting only made the sharks bite harder. That's when the atmosphere shifted. A sleek, matte black speedboat cut through the surf, coming to a dead stop alongside the floating glass platform in the middle of the ocean. The engines purred like sleeping predators. The entire deck went silent. Everyone knew that boat. Everyone knew who was waiting on that platform. From the head of the impossible table, a pair of sharp, unreadable eyes fixed on the woman in the starched apron, the one the elite were currently tearing apart. He watched her endure the insults without flinching, her spine straight despite the verbal poison raining down on her. Those eyes belonged to Im Kyu-Sung, the most feared and powerful mogul on the coast. And he didn't look away. Before we continue with this shocking dinner, if you're new here, this channel brings you the most captivating stories of romance, justice, and women who rise from the shadows to reclaim their power. If you love seeing the underdog win, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Now let's get back to Isabella's story. Isabella turned to leave, her shift finally over, only to be stopped by a voice as cool and calm as the deep water around them. The table is ready, Mr. Kim said, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He didn't gesture toward the shore where the other servants stood. He gestured to the empty velvet-lined seat directly across from his own. You served the dinner, Isabella. Now, you will eat it. A tear escaped, then another, tracing a hot path down her cheek. It wasn't the opulence that broke her. It was the fact that for the first time in years someone actually saw her. Isabella Ritchie hadn't always been a ghost in a service uniform. There was a time when she walked the streets of Atlanta with her head held high, her smile bright enough to stop traffic. Before the struggle, before the betrayal, and before she became a mother fighting the world alone for her daughter, Naomi, Isabella was the girl who had it all. The Atlanta sun was relentless, but for Isabella Ritchie, the heat was just another weight to carry as she navigated the crowded bus toward the high-end district of Buckhead. Her starched white collar felt like a noose, already damp with sweat before her 12-hour shift even began. At 27, she lived her life in the margins, moving like a shadow through a world that only valued her for the speed with which she cleared a table or refilled a glass. Every morning began the same, a rushed goodbye to 6-year-old Naomi, whose wide brown eyes and tight curls were the only light in Isabella's gray world. Be a good girl for Mrs. Gable, okay? She would whisper, pressing a frantic kiss to Naomi's forehead as the babysitter took the child's hand. The guilt was a dull ache in her chest, a permanent companion to the physical exhaustion that never truly left her bones. She was working for a future she could barely see, trading her present moments for the hope that Naomi would never have to know the sting of a starched apron or the invisibility of the service entrance. By 10 a.m., Isabella was already on the floor of the city's most exclusive restaurant. The managers expected perfection and silence. She had learned to move with a straight spine, even when her feet throbbed in her cheap sensible shoes and her back protested the weight of heavy trays. To the patrons she was a ghost with a name tag. They spoke over her as if she were a piece of furniture, their eyes sliding past her face to check the time or signal for more wine. Look at her, a regular would sometimes mutter, his voice dripping with casual disdain. Another one who thinks she can make it here. Isabella never flinched. She had buried her pride deep under her uniform, alongside the memories of the vibrant, ambitious woman she had been before the struggle took hold. Midway through her shift, the hunger and the hours began to blur. She lived for the small breaks where she could hide in the pantry to check a blurry photo of Naomi on her cracked phone. That was the only thing that kept her from shattering when a customer snapped their fingers or when the head waiter barked a fresh set of orders. She was a single mother in a city that didn't care for her story, fighting an uphill battle against a society that saw her as damaged goods, simply because she was struggling to survive alone. As the clock ticked toward the evening rush, Isabella tightened her apron strings once more. She didn't know that tonight the ocean was waiting, and the invisibility she had used as armor was about to be stripped away by a man who saw everything she tried so hard to hide. The atmosphere in the restaurant's kitchen was thick with the scent of searing steak and the sharp metallic tang of tension. Isabella moved with practiced precision, her mind a mental map of table numbers and dietary restrictions, but the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift was beginning to fray her edges. As she pivoted to clear a heavy tray of crystal stemware, a busboy collided with her shoulder, sending a single wine glass shattering across the polished floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the hushed, expensive dining room. Silence rippled through the kitchen as the swinging door settled, and Isabella felt the temperature in the room drop before she even saw him. Mr. Sterling, the floor manager, appeared like a dark cloud, his face twisted into a mask of cold fury. He was a man who prided himself on the restaurant's perfection, a perfection he achieved by treating his staff like disposable parts of a machine. He stepped into Isabella's personal space, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the sweat of her labor. "Do you have any idea what that glass costs, Richie?" he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the other servers pull back into the shadows. Isabella kept her spine straight, her Nigerian heritage lending her a dignity she refused to surrender even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "It was an accident, sir. I'll clear it immediately," she whispered, already reaching for a cloth. But Sterling's hand shot out, pinning the tray she held with a force that made her knuckles white. "Accidents are for people who belong here. You're a ghost, a placeholder for someone more competent. I've told you before, your situation with your daughter isn't an excuse for clumsiness." He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning her worn uniform with blatant disgust. "One more crack in the porcelain, one more motherhood distraction and you're back on the street. I can replace a waitress in 5 minutes. I can't replace my reputation." The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. Isabella felt the familiar sting of shame crawling up her neck, a reminder that in this world of glass and steel, she was as fragile as the shards at her feet. She was an invisible woman, threatened with erasure for the crime of being human in a space designed for the elite. As Sterling turned his back on her, dismissing her existence with a sharp snap of his fingers, Isabella knelt to pick up the broken glass. She didn't realize that from the VIP corner behind the tinted glass of the booth, a pair of sharp dark eyes were watching the exchange, noting the way she didn't break even when the world tried to shatter her. The following morning, the atmosphere in the staff locker room was thick with a frantic, hushed energy. Isabella had barely pinned her name tag to her lapel when Mr. Sterling stormed in, his usual icy composure replaced by a visible jittery anxiety. He clutched a gold-edged manifest as if it were a holy relic, his eyes darting across the room until they landed on Isabella. "Richie, front and center," he barked, though the usual venom in his voice was dampened by a strange, desperate urgency. "There has been a specific request from the Kwan Foundation for a private service, an impossible dinner on the offshore platform. They didn't want the head server. They didn't want the veterans. They asked for the woman who handled the glass breakage yesterday without flinching. The Ice King, Im Kyu-Sung, was a name that carried a weight more profound than any celebrity who had ever darkened their doors. He was the head of a powerful syndicate, a man known for his absolute lack of mercy and a precision that bordered on the supernatural. To serve him was a high-stakes gamble. One wrong move wouldn't just mean a firing, it would mean social and professional erasure. Sterling leaned in, his voice a frantic whisper. "If you mess this up, don't bother coming back to the city. But if you succeed, the tip alone could cover your daughter's school for a year." Isabella's heart seized at the mention of Naomi, the stakes of the evening suddenly crystallizing into a terrifying opportunity. By sunset, Isabella was being transported by a sleek speedboat toward a glass platform that seemed to float miraculously upon the deep, darkening water. The salt spray crusted on her starched apron, a humble souvenir of the journey, while the horizon bled shades of amber and rose. The setting was breathtakingly opulent, a single table set with crystal and silver, glowing under the flicker of candlelight against the vast, indifferent ocean. There, silhouetted against the fading light, sat Im Kyu-Sung. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence commanding the silence of the sea around him. As the boat docked, Isabella stepped onto the transparent floor, her feet aching but her spine straighter than it had ever been. She moved toward the table, the weight of the silver platter in her hands a grounding force against the surreal absurdity of the scene. She felt his gaze before she saw his face, a pair of sharp, unreadable eyes that seemed to trace the very edges of her soul. She was a ghost in a service uniform, prepared to be invisible once more, unaware that this assignment was not a test of her service, but a summons to her vindication. The service was a blur of silver domes and the rhythmic sound of the Atlantic lapping against the glass platform. Isabella moved with the silent efficiency that had become her survival mechanism, her hands steady as she placed the final course, a perfectly seared lobster, before Im Kyu-Sung. The aroma of butter and sea salt rose into the cool night air, but Isabella's mind was already miles away in a small, dimly lit apartment where Naomi would be tucked into bed. Her shift was done. The salt spray had crusted on her starched apron, a humble souvenir from serving a meal in the middle of the ocean. She took a step back, bowing her head in the practiced gesture of a ghost waiting for dismissal. She turned to leave, her feet aching for the relief of the shore, only to be stopped by his voice. It was as cool and calm as the deep water around them, cutting through the silence of the horizon. "The table is ready," Mr. Kim said, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Isabella hesitated, assuming he was signaling for a guest who had arrived in secret. But he gestured not toward the shore or the approaching speedboat, but to the empty velvet-lined seat across from his own. "You served the dinner," he stated, his voice devoid of the sharp edge she had come to expect from powerful men. "Now you will eat it." The words hung in the twilight air, more shocking than the impossible table itself. Isabella stood frozen, her breath hitching in her chest. The brocade on the chair felt like a brand against her worn uniform as she slowly sank into the seat, her senses reeling from the absurdity of the scene. The guest he had been waiting for, the high-profile client Sterling had been so terrified of, was her. A tear escaped, then another, tracing a hot path down her cheek as the crushing weight of his unreadable gaze pressed against her. It wasn't the opulence of the crystal or the gold-edged china that broke her. It was the terrifying realization that she was no longer invisible. In the middle of the vast dark ocean, a man like Im Kyu-Sung was looking at the woman the rest of the world had agreed to forget. She gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and a primal fear that a gesture like this never came without a dangerous price. The flickering candlelight danced in the fine crystal, but to Isabella, the light felt like an interrogation. She sat paralyzed in the plush chair, the luxury of the silk against her skin feeling like a mockery of the starched, salt-crusted apron she still wore. A tear escaped, then another, tracing hot, jagged paths through the weariness on her cheeks as she looked at the succulent meal she had spent the last hour meticulously preparing. It wasn't the opulence that broke her, nor the surreal beauty of the Atlantic sunset bleeding into the horizon. It was the crushing weight of the question in Im Kyu-Sung's unreadable gaze. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. "Is this a joke? Is this how men like you amuse themselves?" The words tumbled out, fueled by the 3 years of invisibility and the constant, biting reminders from her manager that she was nothing more than a placeholder for someone more competent. She thought of Naomi waiting in their cramped apartment, and the sheer absurdity of sitting here, being treated like a guest of honor, felt like a cruel game designed to make her eventual fall even more painful. She waited for the punchline, for him to laugh, to snap his fingers, or to tell her to get back to the kitchen where she belonged. Kyu-Sung didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He simply sat there, his presence as calm and immovable as the deep water surrounding the platform. "You think so little of yourself that you believe kindness must be a trap," he said, his voice deep and devoid of the mockery she expected. He watched her as she clutched the table edge, her knuckles white against the dark wood. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the things Isabella had never dared to say out loud. The exhaustion of the 12-hour shifts, the shame of the starched collar, and the terror of being one broken glass away from the street. The true shock came when Isabella went to the school office to beg for an extension on Naomi's tuition. The administrator looked at her with a confused smile, sliding a receipt across the counter that made the room tilt. The balance was 0. A private foundation had not only covered the year but had a stable. "A gesture like this never comes without a price," Isabella choked out, her heart pounding against her ribs. "What do you want from me?" She looked at him, searching for the dangerous price she was certain would follow. She was a single mother who had learned to survive on the crumbs of the world's respect, and the sudden offer of a full seat at the table felt more like a threat than a gift. As the twilight deepened into a bruised purple, Isabella waited in the silence, her soul bared and trembling, caught between the life she knew and the impossible world this man was forcing her to enter. Kyu-Sung leaned back, the amber glow of the dying sun catching the sharp planes of his face, making him look less like a tycoon and more like a predator at rest. You ask what the price is, Isabella, because you have spent years being told that your worth is a debt you can never fully repay, he said, his voice steady against the lapping of the waves. He reached into his jacket and produced a small leather-bound notebook, placing it on the table between them. But I do not play games with women who have survived what you have. I do not need to invent a price for someone who has already paid in blood and sweat. Isabella watched him, her breath hitching as he opened the book to a page dated months ago. I was in the middle SUV of a convoy passing through the Highland district 3 months ago, he began, his dark eyes fixed on her with an unreadable intensity. The street was crowded, and the air was thick with the kind of casual cruelty that people think goes unnoticed. I saw a group of women, well-dressed, respectable women, stopping a mother in a faded hoodie. They mocked her clothes, her struggle, and the child clinging to her hand. Isabella's heart seized as the memory flooded back. The day the church ladies had cornered her near the grocery store, their laughter like stinging needles. I watched from behind the tinted glass, Kyu-Sung continued, his gaze never wavering. Most people would have crumbled. They would have cried or shouted. But you kept your spine straight. You didn't flinch, and you didn't let your daughter see that their poison had reached you. You walked past them with more dignity than the entire block combined. He turned the page, his fingers tracing a line of notes. I told my man Jungo to find out who the woman with the straight spine was. Since then I have seen you in that restaurant every day. I saw you handle the glass yesterday, and I saw the way that manager tried to erase you. Isabella felt the air leave her lungs, the realization that she had never truly been invisible hitting her harder than any insult ever could. 4 months, while she believed she was a ghost drifting through the margins of society, the most powerful man on the East Coast had been a silent witness to her life. He hadn't seen a server or a damaged single mother. He had seen a survivor. I have seen enough of the world's masks, Isabella, Kyu-Sung whispered, leaning closer until the scent of expensive sandalwood and the salt air enveloped her. I am tired of women who see my name and my power. I wanted to meet the woman who sees people for who they are, even when she is the one standing in the shadows. Isabella felt a cold shiver race down her spine, a sensation far more chilling than the night breeze rolling off the Atlantic. The revelation that Im Kyu-Sung had been a silent witness to her most vulnerable moments didn't bring her comfort. It brought a paralyzing sense of exposure. She looked at the man across the table, his features sharp and immovable in the candlelight, and saw not a savior, but a predator who had spent months tracking his prey. To a woman who had spent years hiding in the shadows to keep her daughter safe, being seen by someone with this much power felt less like a gift and more like a death sentence to her privacy. A man like you doesn't just watch a woman like me for months without wanting something in return, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound defiance. She thought of Naomi Ritchie tucked away in their small apartment, and the terrifying reality of what it meant to have a man of the Kwan Syndicate interested in their lives. In her world, everything had a cost, and she knew she didn't have the currency to pay whatever debt Kyu-Sung was currently racking up on her behalf. Her mind flashed to the dangerous price she had feared from the moment she sat down, a price that might involve her soul, her safety, or worse, the peace she had fought so hard to build for her child. Without a word, Isabella stood up, the legs of the heavy brocade chair scraping harshly against the glass platform. The sudden sound was a jagged tear in the serene silence of the ocean. I can't do this, she choked out, clutching her starched apron as if it were a shield. I'm a server, Mr. Kim. I'm a mother. I don't belong at this table, and I don't belong in your notebooks. She backed away from the flickering candles and the expensive crystal, her eyes wide with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The opulence around her suddenly felt like a gilded cage, and the vast dark water felt like a barrier she had to cross at any cost. She didn't wait for his response. She turned and practically ran toward the edge of the platform where the speedboat was moored, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The salt spray hit her face again, but this time it felt like a splash of reality waking her from a fever dream. As she scrambled onto the boat and urged the confused driver to take her back to the shore, she didn't look back. She refused to see if Kyu-Sung was watching her retreat with that same unreadable gaze. She only knew that she had to get back to the shadows, back to the invisibility that had kept her alive, before the light of his attention burned away everything she held dear. In the days following her flight from the ocean platform, Isabella retreated into a feverish routine, hoping the familiar weight of her invisibility would shield her from the memory of Im Kyu-Sung. She kept her head lower than usual, her starched apron becoming a shroud as she worked herself to the point of collapse, desperate to prove that her life belonged to no one but herself and Naomi. Yet the shadows she relied on were beginning to feel less like a hiding place and more like a stage where a silent benefactor was moving the props. It started with small, impossible things that Isabella couldn't explain. She returned home one evening to find the flickering, dangerous hallway light outside their apartment replaced with a bright, steady glow. Then the heavy front door that had stuck for years, a constant worry for Naomi's safety, opened with a silent, oiled grace. Isabella stood in the hallway, her heart seizing with the familiar, crushing weight of a question she was too afraid to ask. She checked her locks twice that night, her mind racing with the dangerous price such repairs might eventually demand. To fund for Naomi's future extracurriculars. Isabella clutched the paper, her heart pounding not with relief, but with the terrifying realization that Kyu-Sung hadn't let her go. He was resourceful, just as he had claimed, and he was weaving himself into the very fabric of Naomi's life without ever showing his face. On her way home, she saw Naomi playing on the sidewalk, a new high-quality coat wrapped around her small frame. Mrs. Gable, the babysitter, mentioned a delivery man had dropped it off, saying it was a gift for a child with a straight spine. Isabella felt the air leave her lungs. Kyu-Sung was no longer just a watcher from behind tinted glass. He was a silent guardian moving through their world with absolute precision. He was challenging her belief that she was unlovable by caring for the only person who mattered more than her own safety. As she pulled Naomi close, Isabella realized that the ghost she had become was being called back into the light, one act of silent protection at a time. The shift at the restaurant felt heavier than usual, the air thick with the subtle electricity of power and influence that Isabella could never quite escape. While she moved with the silent efficiency of a woman focused solely on her daughter's survival, a different kind of energy was brewing in the kitchen shadows. Her co-workers, who had once ignored her as a ghost with a name tag, now watched her with calculating eyes filled with a sharp, jagged jealousy. They had whispered about the impossible dinner in the sea and the Ice King's inexplicable interest, and in their world a struggling single mom didn't deserve such a sudden elevation. The sabotage began during the chaotic height of the dinner rush. Brianna, a lead server with sharp features and sharper ambitions, watched from the periphery as Isabella balanced a heavy tray for a VIP table. When Isabella stepped away to coordinate a wine pairing, Brianna moved with practiced, merciless precision. She slipped an antique diamond-encrusted brooch, left behind by a socialite in the powder room, deep into the hidden pocket of Isabella's starched apron. It was a cruel game designed to ensure that Isabella's luck with the boss ended in a public humiliating erasure from the only job she had. "Richie, my office." "Now," Mr. Sterling's voice barked through the kitchen, cold and absolute. The laughter of her co-workers followed her, hushed and vicious, as she was marched toward the back. The manager didn't waste time with questions. He accused her of theft in front of the entire staff, his face twisted with fury, as he demanded she empty her pockets. When the glittering diamonds tumbled onto the cold metal prep table, Isabella felt the crushing weight of a familiar shame crawling up her spine. She looked at the faces of the people she had worked alongside for years, seeing only cruel cackles, and the desire to see her shattered. "I didn't take it," Isabella whispered, her spine straight, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a cornered animal. But Sterling only sneered, reaching for the phone to call the authorities, eager to prove that she was damaged goods, after all. He didn't notice the matte black speedboat, docked at the pier, or the two men in dark suits, already standing at the kitchen service entrance. The co-workers' jealousy had created a trap, but they had forgotten one thing. Im Kyu-Sung was resourceful, and he never stopped watching the woman he had chosen. As the manager leveled his final threat, the shadows of the kitchen were suddenly cut through by a presence that commanded the room into a stunned silence. The tension from the accusations of theft still hung heavy in the air when the messenger arrived the following afternoon. Isabella was sitting in her cramped kitchen, her heart pounding with the crushing weight of the manager's threats, when a knock sounded at the door. Standing there was a man in a dark suit, who handed her an envelope of thick cream cardstock etched in gold. Inside was an exclusive charity gala invitation, but it wasn't the gold-edged printing that made her blood go cold. It was the handwritten note at the bottom. "I would be honored by your attendance." It was signed with a single commanding letter. Kyu-Sung was no longer playing a silent game. He was calling her out of the shadows and into the light. Isabella stared at the card, feeling the familiar shame of her starched apron warring with a new terrifying hope. She knew that attending this gala meant facing the calculating eyes of the very people who had mocked her, but she also remembered Kyu-Sung's voice telling her that her scars didn't define her worth. If she stayed hidden, she remained invisible. If she went, she was stepping into a power and influence she couldn't yet imagine. For the next 24 hours, Isabella moved with a straight spine she hadn't felt in years. She reached into the back of her closet and pulled out a simple navy gown that had belonged to her mother. A dress that was outdated maybe, but it was beautiful. As she readied herself, Naomi Ritchie watched with softness and fire in her eyes, sensing that her mother was no longer a ghost. Isabella wasn't just going to a party. She was heading toward a vindicative moment of justice. Kyu-Sung had provided the invitation, and now she had to find the courage to dance in the light he had created for her. The gala was held at a stunning glass and steel event center in Midtown, a place where champagne flowed like water, and crystal chandeliers cast a glow over the elegantly dressed guests. As Isabella stepped out of the car, she felt the subtle electricity of the night. She was no longer the server from the alley or the ocean. She was the guest of honor of the most powerful man in the city. The cruel cackles of the past seemed to fade as she looked toward the entrance, knowing that inside, Im Kyu-Sung was waiting to prove that no man would ever choose her, was the greatest lie she had ever been told. Isabella's breath hitched as she stepped toward the entrance of the Midtown Gala, the subtle electricity of the event humming through the air. Her simple navy gown felt light against her skin, but it couldn't shield her from the calculating eyes of the staff waiting at the door. As she reached the front of the line, she saw a familiar, cruel smile spreading across the face of Mr. Sterling, who was overseeing the guest list with an absolute lack of mercy. He didn't see the woman who had arrived with a straight spine. He only saw the ghost he had threatened with erasure just days ago. "What is this?" Sterling hissed, his voice vicious and low as he stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. "I told you to stay in the shadows, Ritchie. Did you think wearing an old rag would make you belong here?" He looked at her with blatant disgust, his hand reaching out as if to physically shove her back toward the service entrance. "Someone call animal control," he whispered to the security guard beside him, his laughter hushed but cutting. "This isn't a place for household workers or damaged goods trying to play dress-up." Isabella felt the familiar shame crawling up her spine, hot and suffocating as the guests around her began to whisper. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear, just as she always had when the world's cruelty became too much to bear. But before she could turn away, a voice cut through the noise like a blade, cold and absolute. "Is there a problem here?" Im Kyu-Sung stood just 3 feet away, his expression unreadable, and his presence commanding the stunned silence of the entire hall. Sterling's demeanor flipped instantly, his face twisting into a false smile as he bowed slightly. "Mr. Mr. Kim, no problem at all. This woman is she's nobody. I don't know how she got an invitation." Kyu-Sung didn't repeat himself. Instead, he stepped past the manager and stopped directly in front of Isabella, his dark eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "She's with me," he said, the words falling like stones into still water. He extended his hand, the familiar faint smile, touching his lips as he waited for her to take it. In that moment, Isabella understood that she was no longer a ghost being mocked in the dark. She was being vindicated in the light by the most resourceful man she had ever known. As Isabella stepped into the ballroom, her hand trembling slightly in the firm, warm grip of Im Kyu-Sung, The weight of the starched apron finally seemed to lift from her soul. For 3 years she had been a ghost in a service uniform, a woman who wore long sleeves to hide the exhaustion of her labor and the shame of her status. But tonight, under the glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, she was shedding her server's persona. The simple navy gown she wore, a relic from her mother Neka, clung to her with a grace that defied her household worker label. She felt the calculating eyes of the elite tracing her every move, but this time the poison of their cruel cackles couldn't reach her. Kyu-Sung led her to the center of the room, his presence commanding the attention of every socialite and mogul present. Isabella realized that she had spent so long hiding in the shadows, that she had forgotten her own fire. As she stood beside the most powerful man in the city, the crushing weight of her unworthiness began to dissolve. She wasn't just a single mom who had lost her worth in a restaurant kitchen. She was a woman of high cheekbones and full lips, an inheritance of beauty that the scars of poverty could never truly erase. "You see them watching?" Kyu-Sung murmured, his voice cool and calm as the deep water. "They are not looking at a waitress. They are looking at a woman who walked through their cruelty without breaking. Never hide from them again." Isabella lifted her chin, her spine straight, as she met the gazes of those who had once looked through her as if she were nobody. She saw the stunned silence in the eyes of the very people who had mocked her in the alley and on the sidewalk. In the light of the gala, Isabella Ritchie was no longer invisible. She was vindicated, revealing a strength that was far more beautiful than any designer gown in the room. The morning after the gala, the aftermath was swift. Isabella sat in the quiet of her small apartment, holding Naomi close as the world outside began to dismantle the architecture of her long-term servitude and emotional destruction. Im Kyu-Sung had promised her vindication in the light, and he was a man of absolute precision, who knew how to manipulate the system better than anyone. Before the restaurant doors could even open for lunch service, a convoy of black SUVs rolled to a stop at the entrance, their engines purring like sleeping predators. This time it wasn't just a display of power, it was a delivery of truth and justice. Kyu-Sung had used his resourcefulness to dig into the restaurant's dark corners, uncovering fire investigation reports and financial records that had been buried for years. The evidence was irrefutable. Mr. Sterling woke to find 2 attorneys on his doorstep with a civil lawsuit for fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The cruel cackles that had once echoed through the kitchen were replaced by a stunned silence, as testimony from former restaurant employees, those who had been too afraid to speak before, began to flood the light. The very management that had called Isabella nobody and damaged goods now found their own bank accounts frozen and their carefully constructed world crumbling. Within a week, the word had spread through the city's social circles. The church members and socialites who had once mocked Isabella now whispered in horror about the cruelty they had enabled. Brianna, whose credit card stopped working and invitations dried up, watched as the restaurant she had used as a playground for her sharp ambitions was shuttered by a criminal investigation. Kyu-Sung hadn't used violence or revenge in the shadows. He had used the system to show the world that Isabella was stronger than anyone in that room. When Isabella asked why he had gone to such lengths to fight her battle legally and publicly, Kyu-Sung simply looked at her with eyes that held both softness and fire. "You deserve to be seen for who you really are," he murmured, his voice cool and calm as the deep water. The scars of her past were not being erased, but for the first time, the weight of the moment wasn't pressing down on her. It was lifting. The evening air on the penthouse balcony was soft, carrying the faint, clean scent of the ocean that had once been the site of Isabella's greatest fear. Now, as she stood wrapped in the quiet luxury of the high-rise, the crushing weight of her past felt like a distant shore. Isabella leaned against the railing, her spine straight, and her skin bare to the moonlight, no longer needing the starched apron or the hooded shadows she had used as armor for so long. Beside her, Naomi Ritchie leaned into the velvet cushions, her eyes bright enough to stop traffic, as she watched the city lights twinkle like the crystal chandeliers of a world that finally belonged to them. Im Kyu-Sung stepped out from the shadows of the glass doors, his presence no longer that of a feared syndicate boss, but of a man who had really seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. He placed a hand gently on Isabella's shoulder, his touch gentle and steady, a silent promise that the servitude and emotional destruction of her previous life would never return. "Do you see them, Isabella?" he murmured, his voice cool and calm as the deep water. "The city doesn't just see a server anymore. They see the woman who refused to let the world's cruelty make her cruel." Isabella looked at Kyu-Sung, her heart pounding not with terror, but with a wholeness and belonging she had once thought was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought about the ghost she had been, orphaned and scarred, by a system designed to erase her. She thought about every cruel cackle she had endured and every twilight tear she had shed on that floating platform. They were wrong about her worth. Her scars didn't define her, her resilience did. As Naomi reached out to take both their hands, a thunderous sense of peace settled over Isabella's chest. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer alone. The new chapter wasn't just about the 5-star life Kyu-Sung had provided. It was about the vindicative light she now carried within herself. Isabella smiled, a smile that lit up rooms, as she looked toward the horizon. Her story wasn't over. The best chapter was just beginning, and this time she was walking into the warmth of the sun with her face lifted toward the warmth, finally and truly home.